Hey everyone, I'm back with an update on Mardu Angels, which seems to be the best deck in Standard when you take a look at the untap.gg meta tier list stats. As you can see, 68% win rate, 300 matches. Obviously not the biggest sample size, but pretty freaking high nonetheless, even when you compare it to the rank 2, 3, etc. So 68% win rate, 300 matches played. Esper Legends at number 2, 64.5% win rate, 230 matches played. Mono White coming in at number 3 with 63% win rate, 260 matches. Then we've got Rakdos, Grixis, and Azorius Soldiers, all hovering around 62% win rate in that specific order. So, I'm very happy about this, obviously. That means my 29-2 record across all versions of this deck in best of 3 is not just a fluke. I mean, I understand that it's still a relatively small sample size, and I went on a crazy win streak. I went like 13-0 and then lost, and then 15-0 and then lost. So only 2 losses across like 31 matches is pretty insane. And I made a tiny modification to this specific list where I added the Peacekeeper in the main deck, and I added a Xander's Lounge instead of a Cave, or was it Shattered Sanctum? I can't really remember. One of these white-black lands, so it helps cast Brotherhood's End more easily on curve if you so need it. You could theoretically add more red sources, like another Xander's Lounge instead of another Shattered Sanctum, but then I feel like you're messing a little bit with the white, and that could be a problem. I mean, this deck has not the best mana, so you're gonna have to take the L most of the time, I think, when you're trying to fix the mana base, because there's so many color requirements. Other than that, I believe that is the only change. I think there's a second Peacekeeper on the board. I don't remember what I cut for it. You could honestly cut the Bankbuster in the board too. A lot of these cards are pretty flexible, I would say. You just have to keep in mind their CMC. So if you're going to replace something like Shield Red for like Sarah Paragon, that would be okay, right? But if you're going to replace Shield Red, actually, I think starting at 4 mana, like Shield Red could be replaced realistically with a card like Owl or Warden. I think starting at this mana cost, it doesn't really matter as long as it's a strong card. But the most reasonable one is Sarah Paragon, if you so wish. Extraction Specialist is just a spice card that I threw in there. It's been good, but you could honestly just replace it with another Peacekeeper. That would be totally fine. Or another Brotherhood's End if you're finding yourself in trouble against soldiers more often than not. Feel free to do that. Alright, before we jump into the sideboard guide, and I'm going to show off the best of one list, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click that like button. It really helps out a ton, and you can subscribe to my channel for more videos. Link to my Twitch will be in the description, as well as the Google Doc for the sideboard guide if you want a written version. This is the best of one version. Now, of course, I don't play best of one, but I quickly looked at the top archetypes in best of one. It seems to be soldiers and Grixis, which means that I have a pretty reasonable idea as to how to build this deck for best of one. Now, obviously, it's not going to be perfect. If you have some suggestions, comment them down below so other people can take inspiration from those comments of players who actually play best of one. But here's what we're doing. Basically, I cut the Thalias, and I basically cut all the cards that are not unconditionally good, like Specialist. But instead, we have Phyrexian Missionary, which is going to be better against those aggressive decks, while also being a totally reasonably statted creature. Also pretty good at blocking Fable of the Mirrorbreaker against Grixis and other like variants of like Rakdos and Invoke Despair decks. A Braid just to have more interaction on 2. So instead of Thalia, I added 2 more 2-drops to fill in that curve. And then we have another Brotherhood's End in case you face off against all those soldier decks that I hear are in best of one. But they might not be. I have no idea. But if they are, then this is a very good card. It's also pretty good against Grixis. Just a nice comeback mechanic. Then we have a Sarah Paragon for that extra value in the mid game. But that is about it. I'm not really sure what else to add or cut from this deck. But I'm sure that you best of one players can figure that out. And I will try to update this list on the Google Doc whenever I can. Okay, let's get into the sideboard guide. Starting up first, we have Grixis midrange, the Appraiser deck with Invoke Despair, sometimes no Invoke Despair. I don't think it changes that much. So let's see how you're going to board against it. When you're on the play, you want to board out 1 Giada because you don't want more than 3, just because you can draw duplicates, and that could be a little bit of a problem, and you don't really want to commit too hard into their Corpse Appraiser, so removing creatures also makes a lot of sense. Extraction Specialist, because they could have graveyard interaction, you don't want to risk it. You don't really want a 3-mana 3/2 that doesn't do anything. And then 1 Shieldred, just because, again, you don't want to draw too many duplicates, and you want to diversify your threatening cards into other non-legendary permanents. And coming in from the sideboard, we have 2 Unlicensed Hearse to deal with the Appraiser side of things and potentially like Underdog and other nonsense. And this card is extremely good in the current Grixis, against the current Grixis builds, as it dodges Go for the Throats. Peacekeeper coming in, pretty obvious choice, really. The Peacekeeper disrupts really heavily on the play, and it demands an answer most of the time, which clears up the path for your other permanents that will most likely not be removed once this is. Sanctuary Warden, obviously, creature comes in, makes another permanent, really good against sack effects like Anvil Despair and the Liliana, and it also draws a card, and it can draw another card. Pretty damn good with the shield counters. Alright, now we have Grixis on the draw. So when you are on the draw, essentially removing most of your creatures to board an interaction as a way to prolongate the game and move more towards a value battle when you have access to the extra card from being on the draw. So instead of trying to out-tempo them, we are going for a more controlling game plan with 4 Duress coming in, 2 Hearse, 1 Soul Transfer, 1 Brotherhood's End, and 1 Sanctuary Warden. And we're removing the very early game creatures that don't really do that much when you're on the draw, and that you can't use that advantage of them being basically 1 mana behind. Giada comes out entirely, Extraction Specialist obviously, and 2 Shieldred, because why not? I mean, you can really think about the Shieldreds for like some of this interaction, but honestly, it's a little bit risky to play a 4 mana 4/5 into mostly a lot of removal and counter spells when they're on the play. And cards like Invoke Despair if you have no other creatures, which they can control relatively well. Owl comes out, same reason. It's not bad, but since you're removing so many creatures, it can miss or it can be underwhelming. I think that's one of the problems with Owl, and most of the decks are playing Soul Transfer, so they should have an answer for it, or they can counter it. It's a little bit mediocre when you have cards like Sanctuary Warden to board in. Peacekeeper comes out as well. Now this is something you can consider leaving in for like Brotherhood's End if you really wanted to, but I don't think it's that consistently good. But that's for you to decide. My sideboarding plans are a little bit bizarre sometimes. So, all right, next up we have Blue-White Soldiers. When you're on the play, you want to cut 2 Thalia, 1 Extraction Specialist, 1 Owl, and 1 Sanctuary Warden, basically cutting the fat and the cards that are less impactful in the matchup. Pretty straightforward. Expensive creatures are not necessarily that good against a deck that fast, so you want to be careful with that. Bring in Anointed Peacekeeper, 2 more Brotherhood's End, and 2 Emperor to give you a little bit more interaction and disruption overall. Pretty straightforward things. Yeah, I don't think there's much to say about it. That's how I board. But you could also, honestly, you could consider not boarding in as many Brotherhood's End if you really are confident that you're just going to beat them on board straight up. Now, when you are on the draw, essentially exactly the same thing. But this time you actually have to keep in all the Brotherhood's End because you're going to be behind on tempo. I don't know, Soldiers is a relatively easy matchup for this deck, which is why we're not really sideboarding that heavily. And the sideboarding is relatively straightforward, no matter whether we are on the play or on the draw. Okay, next up, we have Mono White Control. Now, when you are on the play, Giada, 1 copy comes out. Same reason as Grixis, kind of, you don't want to draw too many legendaries. And especially in Mono White's case, it is more important to make sure that if they don't have removal for your stuff, that you're not clogged up with cards you cannot cast. Extraction Specialist, because most of the removal is exile. Brotherhood's End coming out, obvious reasons. It's a control deck. 2 Go for the Throat, 1 Shieldred. Pretty straightforward. Peacekeeper comes in, great disruption. Destroy Evil comes in, great removal. Soul Transfer, great removal. Wandering Emperor, best card in the matchup because they have no way of dealing with Planeswalkers. And it dodges all their sweepers as well. If you really want to beat Mono White and you're struggling, you should add a Wandering Emperor to the sideboard. Sanctuary Warden number 2 comes in, draws a card. That's all you could ever want. Now, when you're on the draw, a little bit different. 2 Giada out, 1 Specialist out, Brotherhood's End out, all 3 go for the throat out, Archangel Wrath out, ×1, Shieldred, 1 copy out, Owl comes out. Now, basically, you're on the draw, you can't be as aggressive, you have to cut some things for more interaction. More interaction for duress. Pretty obvious. Take care of their sweepers, take care of their threats, like their Wandering Emperors, Anointed Peacekeeper, more disruption, destroy evil, interaction, soul transfer interaction, Wandering Emperor, we went over it, Sanctuary Warden, we went over it. Pretty straightforward things. I don't think there's that much to talk about, but if there is, I will make sure to update the Google Doc. Now, the annoying mono blue tempo decks. So this is the Djinn, cycle through a bunch of non-creature spells and make a big flying creature. So Giada out, Specialist out, Brotherhood's End out, 4 Archangel Wrath. Pretty much the only matchup where this card is actually mediocre. It's not terrible, but it's not great. The reason for that is it's too expensive to kick, and 3/4 flyer, it doesn't attack into Djinn. Owl comes out, too expensive. Warden comes out, same reason. In for duress, obviously you want to pick apart their hand, make sure they don't have counterspell for your bigger cards. 2 Hearse, attack the graveyard. Djinn gets smaller, great. Destroy evil, destroy the Djinn, destroy the serpents. Peacekeeper, basically duress, no, it's not basically duress. Well, it's a tempo-y duress. Comes into play, makes your opponent think a little more about their next plays, and you get to see the hand. Fantastic. 3/3 Vigilance is great as well. Bankbuster comes in because they have no way of dealing with it. This would be true even against Izzet, as they do have answers for it, but it will force the removal spell onto the Bankbuster, so a Braid in that case. Now, mono blue on the draw. Basically, same thing. It's a very straightforward matchup with cards that are good and cards that are not. Doesn't really matter if you're on the play or the draw. Technically, you could board differently on the play, as in like boarding more creatures, but I don't think that's very important when you're going to outvalue them almost every time. But you could consider being more aggressive in terms of creatures when you're on the play. That's up to you. Next up, we have mono black. When you're on the play, you want to cut 2 Shieldred, 1 Brotherhood's End, and 1 Giada. So, the reason for that is just because there are cards that are better than those cards in this matchup when you're on the play. And here they are. 2 Wandering Emperor, 1 Peacekeeper, 1 Warden. I think it's pretty straightforward. This card is extremely good when you're on the play because mono black sometimes finds itself in a situation where they have to block, and this being a +1/+1 first strike on any creature at instant speed is very devastating for them. Peacekeeper disrupts them pretty heavily as they rely on cards like Invoke Despair to stabilize or Shieldred. Sanctuary Warden comes in, draws a card, flying, everything you could possibly want against mono black. Now, when you are on the draw, a little different. Very different. Giada comes out, 2 Archangel Wrath comes out, 2 Shieldred, Extraction Specialist, and 1 Overseer. Now, the reason for all of these is just that there are a bunch of creatures that are either too slow or too clunky. That's not the case for Overseer, but there are better cards that I'm boarding in for it. But actually, you could consider, if you think your opponent is not very aggressive, to swap out the Overseer and the Brotherhood's End, which means you would not cut Overseer and you would not board in Brotherhood's Ends. That's up to you. Either way, for duress, you got to take their Invoke Despairs, you got to take their Liliana, because when they're on the play with those, it hurts. You will lose the game to Liliana on 3 most of the time. Peacekeeper, pretty obvious. It's a 3/3. It lines up extremely well with their deck, and obviously it hurts their curve. Very important. Warden, we talked about it. Wandering Emperor. Now, only 1 copy of Wandering Emperor instead of 2. You could argue, honestly, there's a pretty good argument for 2. I think that's totally reasonable. you could probably cut the Overseer okay, now it's getting a little too complicated. But you could potentially not board in Brotherhood's End for Wandering Emperor. If you think that, again, they're not going wide. This is just a nod to some of the decks that are a little more aggressive. But you could also cut the Bank Buster too. I think this Wandering Emperor should probably be a 2 of on the draw. But it's kind of hard to cut things. You could cut Peacekeeper. Honestly, any of these are interchangeable with Wandering Emperor. It's going to be up to you. I think I would recommend boarding in the second Wandering Emperor against most mono black lists, but I like the diversity of having like the extra copy of Peacekeeper, the one Brotherhood's End in case things go sideways, the Soul Transfer, the one Bank Buster for card advantage. A lot of these cards serve their purpose really well. But you know what? Let's do this. You could cut a second Overseer for Wandering Emperor. I think that's fine. Okay, now we have the Anvil Decks. Now it says Rakdos here, but you can pretty much include any Anvil deck. So that means Jund, Grixis, same thing, pretty much. With some minor changes, but they're too minor to really note them down, really. It's if you board the same way every time, it's fine. This matchup is very good for you. Out, 3 Giada, 1 Specialist, clunky 3-drop, and we don't really care about 2-drops since we're going to be sweeping. Peacekeeper comes in, it's really good against Anvil. Even if they don't have cards in hand, you can name Anvil, and it hurts them. You can name any activated ability. It hurts them a lot. Just board it in, trust me. Two Brothers End, straightforward, destroys all artifacts, pretty much everything they have. Sanctuary Warden, draws a card, Flyer. Flyers are really good in this matchup. Okay, on the draw, well, as you can see, no difference. This matchup is extremely good for you. As long as you have these cards coming in, you're good to go. Alright, next up we have Rakdos, Invoke Despair. Pretty much the same, kind of similar to the mono black matchup, but they have a lot more resilience and versatility with the Fable, the Mirror Breaker. So we're cutting 2 Giada, 2 Shieldred, and Extraction Specialist when we're on the play. For 3 Duress, because they have, so the difference between mono black and Rakdos is that they have more non-creatures, right? So you want the Duresses even on the play. 3 Duress, 1 extra Peacekeeper, 1 Warden. Value, tempo, disruption. Well, hand disruption, yeah. Now, when you're on the draw, a little bit similar to most of these weird, grindy matchups. Giada comes out entirely. Shieldred, 2 copies out. Specialist out. Peacekeeper out. You're bringing in more interaction. And now this is especially important. Brotherhood's End has to come in because it's Rakdos. They have Fable the Mirror Breaker, and that's really scary. When they go wide, you need something to control that. But to be honest, I do think... Actually, you know what? I'm going to change this a little bit. I think we can do... Yeah, you don't have to board in all 3 copies. So this is +2. There's already 1 in the main deck. So what I would do is just board in 1 extra and play maybe 1 Giada or 1 Shieldred to your discretion, whatever you like. Sanctuary Warden, number 2 comes in, and Soul Transfer. Because of Archangel of Wrath, you don't necessarily need all 3 copies. Although it is... Honestly, you can't go wrong with 3 copies. But I would say you could, like... You could get away with playing 2 overall. So just boarding in 1. That will be up to you. Now, last but not least, we have Esper Midrange. Now, this deck has not been as popular in the Brothers War, but it's still very good. So let's talk about it. On the play, you want to take out Thalia's, you want to take out the Extraction Specialist and the Brotherhood's End, and 1 Archangel of Wrath, as this card is a little bit less good in this matchup since they don't really have 2 toughness creatures. Wandering Emperor comes in very strong on the play against Esper, especially because they will make blocks with that Raffine sometimes, and they will get punished. And it's also good from behind, so this card's fantastic. Peacekeeper is fantastic as well. This creature is a nightmare for them, especially paired with Wandering Emperor because of a 3 power going up to 4. And the disruption on their creatures is extremely difficult to manage as Esper. Good removal spell against Esper. 4 toughness, hits about everything. Can hit Wedding Announcement as well. And Soul Transfer is fantastic against Owl. Now, when you are on the draw, you want to basically cut out most of the little bit too slow cards, but also, you know, 1 Giada because we want to be more controlling. Archangel of Wrath is just too slow. This is what I was talking about. The kicker, you do not have time. You do not have time to really use this efficiently. It's still fine to have 2 copies because it's so versatile, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's that good. Owl comes out as well, just because it's a clunky 5-drop, and it doesn't actually do that much in the matchup on the draw. I feel like you could keep it for an Archangel. This is up to you, really. I think Owl probably is stronger than Archangel. So yeah, I would just take out 3 Archangel, honestly. I'm thinking about it. It's debatable. Up to you, really. This is pretty flexible, I would say. 2 Emperor in, same thing. So basically exactly the same thing, but boarding in 1 hearse, as they usually play a lot of things that come back from the graveyard with Disturb or Blitz. So having this type of controlling element, you can even board in the second one, really. It really depends on what kind of deck you're facing. So some have way more things that they're bringing out the graveyard, but some have less. So 1 is minimum, 2, it's if you feel like you need the second one, really. It's up to you. You can take out another Archangel if you want. The card is not the best in this matchup either. So yeah, that's gonna do it